You think you'd know if someone found your shelter. You wouldn't. The best trackers move through your camp, leaving nothing broken, nothing missing, nothing your eyes are trained to catch. You left your shelter for less than 2 hours, and when you came back, something felt wrong before you even saw it. The air near the entrance smelled different. A branch that had leaned one way now leaned another. Your mind wanted to dismiss it as wind or an animal, but wind does not fold a tarp corner the wrong direction, and animals do not step around a trip line without breaking it. This is the moment survival instructors call the silent alarm, the split second where your body senses danger before your brain can name it. And in wilderness survival, in bug-out situations, in off-grid living, that instinct is often the only warning you get that another human being has been inside your camp while you were gone. Most people assume they would simply know if someone visited their shelter because they picture obvious damage, missing gear, a ransacked pack. That assumption is the first and most dangerous misunderstanding in this entire subject. A patient intruder, whether a curious hiker, a desperate person in a grid-down scenario, or someone with hostile intent, will almost never leave obvious damage. Experienced trackers and search and rescue veterans will tell you that skilled human movement through terrain is designed to minimize disturbance, not maximize it, because disturbance draws attention, and attention is the last thing an intruder wants. So the shelter looks untouched on the surface, while underneath that surface, dozens of small physical facts have changed. The hidden science here comes from a field called forensic tracking, sometimes taught under combat tracking or man-tracking programs used by military units and border enforcement teams. The core principle is that human passage through any environment always transfers energy into that environment. An energy transfer always leaves residue, even when the person tries to be careful. Footfall compresses soil and leaf litter in patterns that differ from wind or animal weight distribution. Human hands disturb spiderwebs, and spiderwebs rebuild in geometric patterns that take time, so a torn web near your shelter door that is only partially rebuilt can give you a rough sense of how recently someone passed through, since different spider species rebuild at very different speeds. Scent is another overlooked channel, because human skin oil, synthetic fabric, and even breath carry volatile compounds that linger on surfaces far longer than most people expect, sometimes for many hours, depending on humidity, wind, and the surface they settle on. The evidence for this comes from search and rescue tracking methods, where trackers read disturbed moss, crushed insects, and directional bending of grass stems, sometimes days after the person had passed. Research on scent tracking dogs shows that even careful hikers can leave a disturbance trail detectable for hours, and in some conditions for several days, depending on weather, terrain, and the individual dog. If a trained dog can detect it, a trained human eye can detect the physical version of that same disturbance if that human knows exactly where to look. This is not folklore. This is applied physics and applied biology, the transfer of kinetic energy and biological residue from one organism into a static environment. The survival implication of this principle is direct and urgent. If you build a shelter for extended use, you need to establish what trackers call a baseline, a documented mental or physical record of exactly how your camp looked before you left it. Photograph or mentally catalog the position of every piece of gear, the angle of every branch you used for camouflage, the pattern of leaves at your entrance. Without a baseline, you have no way to detect change, and without detection of change, you cannot know your shelter has been compromised until it is too late, until the person who found it decides to act on that knowledge rather than simply observe it. This single failure, the failure to establish a baseline, is exactly what leaves long-term campers and off-grid dwellers vulnerable to being surprised, robbed, or displaced by people who had been watching your camp for days before making contact. As you internalize this first layer of detection, the danger escalates because knowing someone found your shelter is only half the problem. The other half is understanding what that person's presence actually means for your immediate safety, and that requires a second, deeper layer of analysis most survivalists never reach. The next dangerous scenario is more immediate than the first. Imagine returning to your shelter and finding a single small object placed just inside your entrance. A stone, a knot of cordage, or a cluster of leaves arranged in a pattern that does not occur naturally. Your first instinct might be confusion, maybe even relief, because nothing appears stolen. This is exactly the reaction that a documented human behavior pattern called probing contact is designed to produce. Probing contact refers to a low-risk method some individuals use to test whether a shelter is occupied and how its occupant reacts before committing to a direct confrontation or theft. Most people misunderstand probing contact because they assume any interaction with another human in a survival context will be loud, aggressive, or immediately threatening. In reality, human behavior researchers who study conflict avoidance describe a well-documented pattern where a person testing territory will use subtle, deniable signals first. This mirrors territorial behavior studied across many social species, where an intruder tests boundaries with a small, low-commitment action before escalating. The hidden science behind this is rooted in game theory and evolutionary psychology, both of which show that testing behavior minimizes risk to the tester while gathering maximum information about the target's awareness and vigilance. This kind of behavior shows up in observations from search and rescue teams and in research on homeless encampment dynamics, where people scouting an occupied space will sometimes leave a small marker, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes deliberately, as a way of testing reaction without direct confrontation. Similar territorial testing signals appear in accounts of nomadic and semi-nomadic groups across multiple cultures, suggesting this is a deeply rooted behavioral pattern rather than a modern criminal tactic alone. This means the small object you found is not paranoia. It is a documented and repeatable behavioral signature, and dismissing it removes your ability to respond before a second, more direct contact occurs. The survival implication here demands a shift in mindset. If you discover evidence of probing contact, the correct response is not to remove or destroy the object immediately, because doing so signals awareness without giving you any additional information. Instead, experienced survivalists recommend quietly increasing your own observation of the surrounding terrain, watching for repeat visits at consistent times of day, since humans are creatures of habit even when trying to remain covert. Establishing a hidden observation point, even a simple one using natural cover, allows you to gather information about the other party before they gather more information about you. This principle, watch before you react, is one of the most consistently taught rules in wilderness self-reliance training, precisely because reacting too early can escalate a passive test into an active confrontation. This escalation risk brings us to a more urgent layer of the problem, because probing contact does not always stay passive. When a tester senses no reaction or senses vulnerability, some individuals will shift from testing to direct interference. And this next stage of the pattern is where the danger becomes physical rather than purely informational. Picture arriving back to your shelter and finding your water container moved several feet, its cap loosened, though nothing appears to be missing. Many survival guides never address this scenario directly because it does not fit the simple binary of theft versus no theft. This is a mistake because tampering without removal is one of the most dangerous signals a returning survivor can encounter, and it is consistently misunderstood as a low-priority event. People assume that if nothing is stolen, the risk is minimal, but emergency medicine and toxicology experts point out that tampering with a water source, even without removing it, can introduce contamination that is invisible to the naked eye. Bacterial introduction from unwashed hands, foreign residue, or even deliberate contamination is a real risk anytime an unknown party has handled your water. And that risk only grows in drought-affected regions, where water access can become a source of tension. The hidden science here involves basic microbiology, since pathogens introduced into a water container can multiply rapidly in body temperature conditions, particularly in humid climates, turning a seemingly minor act of tampering into a serious health threat within hours. The evidence for this danger is well established in disaster relief literature, where public health researchers have repeatedly documented waterborne illness outbreaks in refugee and disaster shelter settings, since contamination is so often invisible to the naked eye. Emergency management agencies have issued guidance after natural disasters, instructing displaced individuals to treat unattended water sources as potentially compromised, precisely because contamination cannot be assessed visually. This guidance exists because real documented illness outbreaks have occurred from exactly this kind of overlooked contamination. For survival purposes, the implication is strict and non-negotiable. Any water container that shows signs of movement, cap displacement, or altered water level while you are away should be treated as contaminated and either purified through boiling or filtration, or discarded entirely if you have alternative water sources. This is not over-caution. It reflects standard emergency management protocol used after hurricanes, floods, and other mass displacement events, where water security is treated as a primary survival variable, arguably more important than immediate physical confrontation. This principle also extends to food storage, since food tampering carries similar contamination risk and is documented extensively in wilderness medicine case studies involving animal and human interference with unsecured supplies. As this pattern of tampering escalates, from scent and disturbance to probing objects to direct interference with survival resources, a larger and more unsettling pattern begins to emerge, one that ties every previous clue into a single coordinated timeline, and understanding that timeline is the key to correctly assessing your overall risk level. At this point in the analysis, it becomes necessary to step back and examine how these individual signals connect into what collapse theory researchers and emergency planners call a cumulative risk timeline. A single disturbed spiderweb might mean nothing. A single moved water container might be explained by wind or wildlife, but when these signals appear together, in sequence over a period of days, they form a pattern that statisticians and risk analysts would recognize as a rising probability curve rather than a series of isolated coincidences. The common misunderstanding at this stage is treating each piece of evidence in isolation, evaluating and dismissing it individually rather than tracking it cumulatively over time. This is a documented cognitive bias called normalcy bias, well studied in disaster psychology, where individuals repeatedly underestimate danger because each incremental sign, viewed alone, seems too small to justify serious concern. Normalcy bias has been cited as a contributing factor in numerous documented disaster response failures, where people delayed evacuation or defensive action because no single warning sign felt severe enough to act on immediately. The hidden science combating normalcy bias is simple but powerful, and it comes from basic pattern recognition and probability theory. If you maintain a mental or written log of environmental disturbances, no matter how small, you convert scattered anecdotal impressions into an actual data set. Once you have 3 or more independent signals within a short time window, spiderweb disturbance, object placement, resource tampering, the probability that these are unrelated coincidences drops sharply, following the same logical principle used in medical diagnosis, where multiple minor symptoms occurring together increase diagnostic confidence far more than any single symptom alone. The evidence for this approach comes directly from military and emergency management doctrine, where indicators and warnings analysis, a formal intelligence methodology, is built entirely on this same principle of tracking low-level signals cumulatively rather than dismissing them individually. This methodology, refined in part through the study of missed warnings like Pearl Harbor and September 11th, is built on forcing analysts to document minor anomalies systematically rather than relying on gut instinct alone, which is exactly the same discipline an individual survivalist should apply to their own shelter security. The survival implication of adopting this cumulative mindset is transformative. Instead of asking, "Did something happen today?" you begin asking, "How many independent signals have accumulated this week, and what does that trend suggest about your exposure?" If your signal count is rising, the appropriate response escalates from passive observation to active countermeasures, which may include relocating your shelter, establishing a decoy camp, increasing physical security measures like trip lines with noise alerts, or in some cases making direct, cautious contact with the other party to de-escalate, rather than allowing an unknown situation to develop further in silence. This brings the analysis to its final and most important dimension, the one that ties physical evidence, human behavior, and cumulative risk assessment into a single overarching principle that every long-term survivalist eventually has to confront, whether they are living off-grid by choice or forced into that situation by circumstance beyond their control. The final and most sobering truth in this entire subject is that shelter security was never really about hiding your location perfectly, because in almost every documented case of long-term wilderness or disaster survival, perfect concealment eventually fails. Terrain changes, foot traffic increases, drought exposes hidden water sources, and human curiosity, especially in resource-scarce environments, tends to find what it is looking for eventually. This is a documented pattern across historical accounts of long-term wilderness living, disaster displacement, and off-grid homesteading, where concealment worked temporarily, but almost never permanently. The deeper and more useful truth, supported by both survival science and behavioral research, is that detection and response speed matter far more than concealment alone. Emergency management literature consistently shows that survival outcomes correlate more strongly with how quickly a person notices and correctly interprets a threat signal than with how well they hid in the first place. This reframes the entire subject. Shelter security is not a static wall you build once. It is a continuous, active discipline of observation, pattern recognition, and calibrated response that must be practiced daily, because the moment you stop watching for small signals is the moment a slow, patient threat can finally close the distance undetected. This is the buried lesson inside every case study on wilderness intrusion, disaster displacement conflict, and off-grid security. The shelter itself was never the true defense, your awareness was. And awareness only works if you refuse to dismiss the small, uncomfortable signals your environment gives you. The bent branch, the moved container, the scent that should not be there. Because each one is a data point in a pattern larger than any single moment. And in survival, the people who notice the pattern early are consistently the ones who make it through, while the people who wait for undeniable proof are consistently the ones who are caught by surprise. And that single difference, patient observation versus comfortable denial, is the real hidden science behind knowing someone found your shelter while you were gone.